Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage and my partner in crime, Dr. Erica Riggleman. How are you today?
I'm doing great.
Happy New Year. This is the first podcast of the new year. We're going to say this is the first episode of season 4 of Thyroid Answers Podcast. So it comes along, and I think we broke the 100,000 download last year sometime. So hopefully we get more great podcasts coming in the future and more great guests, and we keep this puppy rolling for a bit.
Absolutely.
So one of the topics the topic we want to cover today is cold intolerance, because there are so many patients that I see who are chronically cold, right? Their core is cold. They can't get warm. Doesn't matter how many blankets they put on, how many pairs of socks. They're just always cold, right? Have you ever experienced that with your patient base?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that this is a common symptom that people have, but they don't associate it with a health condition or even think that that's a problem. Some people just think, oh, well, I've always been cold, or, everybody in my family is really, really cold. And they just think they need more socks, more jackets, more sweaters. And they kind of become, that immune to it. They think that that's just part of their normal life, and not realizing that that's maybe a little bit of an indication that something may be going on. So I think this is a great topic to kind of shed some light that, if you are experiencing that, there you may want to look into it. I think that this will be a great topic.
Yeah. So thyroid hormone plays a critical role in what we call thermogenesis, and that's the body's ability to generate heat. Now, I think when people have tiredness, fatigue, thinning hair, and they're cold intolerant, they assume that they probably have a thyroid condition. But there's a whole bunch of people that are diagnosed with euthyroidism, normal thyroid physiology, because their TSH is normal, and are struggling with being chronically cold extremities. And thyroid hormone still probably playing a role in that. So we'll talk about that as well. But one of those things that's really important is to realize that if you are struggling with chronic extremity cold, you got to go to bed with socks on your feet. If your core temperatures just seems like you can never get warm, there is something wrong. As Dr. Erica said, it's not a normal situation, and it needs to be looked into and checked into. And kind of the good part is, if you get if somebody looks at your TSH and they say you're normal, or they check out a bunch of your circulation and those things look good, the good news is you may not have a pathology, but you definitely still have some level of dysfunction.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people who have thyroid dysfunction, they're not going to have all of the symptoms. Somebody may just have cold intolerances. That may be one of the very first signs that they start to notice, is that, you're noticing that you're having to put more sweaters on and everybody else is sitting in, t-shirts and shorts. I think that that's like a big indication, is that becoming self-aware that, you have a temperature that your body wants to stay at. And when you start to deviate and you feel cold and have that sense that, you want to put on more clothes, that, something else may be going on. And I think that this is a great, opportunity to discuss this. So there's multiple ways that the body can be heated up. Do you want to explain the two main types that heat is generated in the body?
Yeah, absolutely. So the body has these two, what we call heat generating or thermogenic processes. One is called obligatory thermogenesis, which is essentially basal. It's the heat generated by your basal metabolic function. So your stomach working, your heart working, your liver working, your blood pumping, your muscle activity. So in the day-to-day activities of the body generates a certain amount or level of heat. And that heat that's generated from basal metabolic functions is usually enough to keep somebody warm in a mild temperature. So say we're in that 70-degree range, which is where we pretty much hang out. The amount of heat generated by these basal metabolic actions can keep us around that 98.6 kind of degrees. Okay. If you think about this, for the person listening, when your refrigerator's running to try and keep things cold, it generates heat, right? When your car's running, it generates heat. When your washing machine is running, it generates heat. So all that machinery generates some level of heat. your body, anytime it's running, generates some level of heat, and that's called obligatory thermogenesis. The other type of thermogenesis or heat production occurs via something called facultative thermogenesis, or I like to refer to it more as adaptive thermogenesis. So what happens is the body senses a drop in temperature. Maybe you go outside, or you lost the heat in your house, and the temperature drops and your core body temperature starts to drop a degree or two. Your body starts to kick in mechanisms to try and bring the core temperature back. So we'll go through things like you'll get vasoconstriction and piloerection of the hairs on the body. And this is designed as a heat generate or heat saving mechanisms. We do a bunch of heat saving mechanisms in facultative, in facultative, and we do a bunch of heat generating mechanisms when temperature drops. So, vasoconstriction, cut off the blood flow to extremities to keep the blood closer to the core and prevent dissipation of heat and further loss of heat. That's going to cause your extremities, your fingers, your toes to be colder. We get the hairs and the muscles around the hairs starting to contract to decrease the loss of heat through the skin. We do things like put clothes on, put a blanket on, we come in mobile, we curl up in a ball. Those are heat saving mechanisms. And then we kick in heat generating mechanisms to try and generate more heat. We have shivering, that's that involuntary muscle contraction that can generate heat. And then we have non-shivering mechanisms, which is totally regulated by thyroid hormone. And this is where the body increases thyroid hormone production to drive more thyroid hormone to those heat generating organisms, specifically the brown adipose tissue, to some degree the white adipose tissue, but that's kind of controversial, liver, muscle tissue, even the heart, all are tissues that can generate heat. And then the other aspect of the non-shivering heat generating facultative system is the activation of what we call the sympathetic nervous system, which is most people kind of know as their fight or flight system. But when we increase that sympathetic nervous system, that too starts to stimulate what we call the brown adipose tissue, which is essentially brown fat tissue, to essentially melt off the fat stores and use those fat stores to generate energy, and that energy as heat. So those are the two ways, obligatory and facultative. Obligatory is the heat that's generated just by every day-to-day functions. And then the facultative or adaptive thermogenesis is the heat that's generated when that basal metabolic function isn't enough to maintain our core temperature.
Yeah. And I think that, thyroid hormone, if you think about it in just the rawest form, is really meant to stimulate metabolism and stimulate, it's really the gas pedal essentially. So if you imagine your car and you're sitting there pushing your gas pedal, you're going to rev your engine, which is going to create heat. So it makes sense that your body, one of its first mechanisms is going to try to upregulate thyroid hormone to try to stimulate that heat production. So I think that's an important thing to realize, is that thyroid hormone plays a direct role in that amount of heat that you're actually generating. And when we're talking about the adaptive part of the thermogenesis, we are redirecting. You said your hands and your feet are going to get colder, but blood flow is really, really important to those extremities. And when you start to deal with that long term, I think that's where you can start to develop maybe neuropathies or other issues where you're not delivering the nutrients because your body's really trying to go into that protective mode. And I think that can be a correlation where sometimes I see people come in who have underlying thyroid issues, but they also have neuropathies in their hand and feet because that is leading to some of that blood flow disruption.
Yeah, I think people wouldn't necessarily, if your hands or feet are cold and the first thing you're thinking about is circulation. And most people aren't thinking, oh, my thyroid's probably affected, right? And you think, my circulation's a little reduced. It probably runs in my family. And if somebody's going and getting a thyroid panel done and they're just running TSH and it's not above, 6 or more, then it may not be assumed that they have some level of a thyroid condition, but thyroid hormone and inability to maintain core temperature maybe, as you said, an early indication that there's problems with thyroid physiology. And as you said in the beginning, you don't develop all your symptoms on one day, and then you have hypothyroidism. Usually there are a slow creep of symptoms as systems start to become compromised, and it's just the accumulation of those symptoms over time. And then somewhere down the line, we start to say, man, maybe all of these things are related to a thyroid condition, or somebody does a TSH level and it's out of range. And then somebody says, do you have these symptoms? Oh yeah, I had those symptoms. I thought they were normal. And says, oh, well, you have hypothyroidism. But yeah, definitely that the beginnings of cold feet, cold toes, having to go to bed with socks is probably an indicator that, hey, something's wrong here.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds all great. The thyroid's going to kick on, try to produce more hormone, but does that actually mean that heat generation is actually going to happen? Or is there obviously steps in between that have to take place? Because if that was the case, every person that, turned on that adaptive thermogenesis would then feel warm and they wouldn't be cold again. So why do people have these lingering symptoms? What's the disconnect?
So when somebody has hypothyroidism, and let's break it down like glandular and cellular, right? We talk about glandular hypothyroidism is where the thyroid gland can't make thyroid hormone sufficiently. Typically, it's called primary hypothyroidism. Primary causes Hashimoto's thyroiditis, but the gland can't make enough thyroid hormone. So if the gland can't make enough thyroid hormone, then there's not enough thyroid hormone in the blood, and there's not enough thyroid hormone to these heat-generating tissues. Therefore, basic metabolism is going to be compromised, and heat generation is going to be compromised. So anybody who's got glandular hypothyroidism is more than likely going to have problems with just lower basal metabolic function, basal metabolism, and therefore lower heat production in the body. So their core temperature is going to be reduced. And you hear people talk about, hey, if you want to see if you have a thyroid problem, take your first morning temperature and stuff. And the reality is, if that core temperature is reduced, it is probably a good sign that there's problems with thyroid physiology, right?
What kind of number would indicate that it's a lower number? Is it anything, lower than, the 80, 85.6, or what's a number that somebody can actually look at and say, okay, maybe I need to suspect I've got some low thyroid issues?
I think if you're chronically below 2 to 3 degrees below that 98.6, you got to start having some concerns, especially if you have other symptoms that go along with it. But yeah, it shouldn't be. I think that thermoneutral zone is somewhere around that 2 degree mark. So if it's below that, the body should be kind of helping maintain, kick that back up. So I'd say if you're anywhere 2 to 3 degrees below normal or above normal, okay, which might be more of a hyperthyroid state, you got to start to have some concern or ask some questions.
Yeah.
So we talk about thyroid hormone affecting basal metabolic functions. If there's not enough thyroid hormone made by the gland, then there's not enough getting to the tissues, and therefore our metabolism doesn't run as high. We don't have as much obligatory thermogenesis, and we're going to have a tendency to be colder. The other issue that occurs is that when there is a drop in temperature, like you go outside and you get this cold exposure, that cold exposure is detected by nerve endings that are cold receptors, and those cold receptors go up to the hypothalamus, an area in the brain, and tell the brain, hey, we're cold, we need to activate this adaptive thermogenesis. And so TRH goes up, TSH goes up, and we get the stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system then sends projections out to the body, especially the brown adipose tissue, this brown fat tissue. And the sympathetic stimulation of that brown adipose tissue then activates this mechanism where we can start to break down the triglycerides and fats in the brown adipose tissue to use as heat and energy. And if there is cold exposure we need two things to happen. We need the hypothalamus to be stimulated so there is conversion T4, T3 in the brain, in that hypothalamic area, but we need the sympathetic nervous system to kick in, and that will almost always kick in when there's cold exposure. But if the sympathetic nervous system starts to stimulate and activate the brown adipose tissue, but there's not enough thyroid hormone, specifically T3, inside the cell, the brown adipose tissue cells, the actions of the sympathetic nervous system won't work and the heat generation will fail. So you have to have thyroid hormone being produced to get into the cell to stimulate increased basal metabolism, and you need that thyroid hormone in the cell to support what the fight or flight system's trying to do to the brown adipose tissue by activating it. So hypothyroidism from the gland, and which means there's decreased thyroid hormone in the blood. That means there's decreased thyroid hormone in the cells. It's going to be it's really going to be a double whammy when it comes to trying to support heat generation, because there just isn't enough to increase the basal metabolism, and there's not enough then, therefore, to help support the sympathetic nervous system's desire to try and kick up metabolism.
Yeah, so I think what you're kind of saying is that the cellular resistance plays a huge role in, at least one aspect of the thermogenesis, is that, where we talk about all the time that, cellular hypothyroidism, that can be the heart of, you can have normal labs, you can have, still have the symptoms, but that could be playing a role in why you're still cold, because you're just not getting the hormone to where it needs to be.
So we talked about the glandular hypothyroid condition. Now we got to consider when we talk about cellular hypothyroidism, which is what you were referring to. And cellular hypothyroidism is a different mechanism to some degree, because you can have normal thyroid hormone production by the gland, normal thyroid hormone in the bloodstream, but what happens in the cell is critical. And so if the cell is favoring deactivation of thyroid hormone, conversion of T4 to reverse T3, T3 to T2, you aren't going to have sufficient levels of T3 in the brown adipose tissue to actually drive metabolism. Mm-hmm. So somebody could have normal gland, normal TSH, normal T4, but still be freezing because their brown adipose tissue is having a higher level of deactivation of thyroid hormone versus activation, and therefore they're going to be cold. So that's a situation where they're going to go to their doctor, and their doctor's going to say, you don't have a thyroid problem, you're fine, there's nothing wrong with you, you're crazy, go exercise more, become more active. But this is a situation where somebody may really struggle. Cold core, cold extremities, and the rest of the hypothyroid symptoms. We have to be looking at the possibility that this is a person who's struggling with cellular hypothyroidism. And as we've said in the past, people with glandular hypothyroidism, there's a really high probability that they have cellular hypothyroidism because there's just not enough thyroid hormone produced. But not everybody who has cellular hypothyroidism has glandular hypothyroidism, at least not at the onset.
Absolutely. So is this kind of the reason why somebody who's already taking, whether that's Synthroid, levothyroxine, some sort of, T4 medication, why they could still have, cold symptoms or cold intolerance, because because T4 obviously has to be converted, has to get inside the cell. Could this be the reason why they may be on thyroid meds but still have symptoms such as cold issues?
Yeah. So let's talk about this, because this is a little bit complicated, but I hear, you hear people say, I'm on LT4, Synthroid, levothyroxine, and, I'm still freezing, I'm still cold, I'm still tired, I'm still fatigued, I still have issues. So what the literature and the research shows is that, and let me be clear, when we talk about what the literature shows, there's a lot of argument about how there's agreement that thyroid hormone plays a critical role in thermogenesis. But there is some argument as to how this whole process takes place. But most of what we're talking about today is stuff that most people agree on. But when the nervous system is kicked into gear to help increase metabolism, the elevation of TRH, that's thyroid releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, and TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone produced by the pituitary gland, both can play a role directly in increasing thyroid hormone conversion in the peripheral tissues. So as TRH goes up, TRH rises, we get a number of things happen, but one of those things that happens peripherally is an increase in something called deiodinase 2. Deiodinase 2 is the enzyme that converts T4 to T3 and helps provide more T3 inside that brown adipose tissue for thermogenesis. So the issue can be that when somebody's actually hypothyroidism, there's not enough thyroid hormone in the tissue, they got this primary hypothyroid condition, and their doctor gives them thyroid hormone. If there is no cellular stress, cellular damage, or mechanism that would have induced cellular hypothyroidism first, they take LT4 therapy, Synthroid, levothyroxine, it gets into the bloodstream, it gets to these metabolically heat-generating tissues, and T4 gets converted to T3, it stimulates metabolism, and everything's good. But for the person who takes thyroid hormone and then they're still cold, their core temperature's still low, their hands and their extremities are still cold, what's likely happening is that they are getting enough T4 to suppress their TRH and TSH in the brain. Those values are dropping. They're getting enough thyroid hormone to support the hypothalamus in the brain, what we call the HPT axis, hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, but it's not sufficient levels of thyroid hormone T4 to support all the peripheral tissues. So brain gets satisfied, TRH drops. As TRH drops, now we essentially start to shut down the sympathetic nervous system, and we decrease that deiodinase 2 in the peripheral tissues. And now the body has a harder time converting T4 to T3. And so the person's still going to struggle. Is that followable, or do we need to simplify that a little bit?
No, I think that's a good explanation. Is it possible that somebody gets prescribed T4 and they actually feel worse?
Yeah, absolutely. So if somebody has hypothyroidism that starts at the gland, right? There's no problems in cell function that would cause greater conversion of T4 or T3 to the inactive forms. And so you give them T4 therapy. The T4 therapy gets to the blood, it gets to the cells and tissues, it's carried into the cells and tissues, and then it is converted into the active hormone and stimulates metabolism. If that works, everything's good. However, if hypothyroidism started as a result of cellular dysfunction, and we talk about this all the time, cellular stress, cellular trauma causes danger signals to be released, and part of that danger process is the slowing down of some of these basal metabolic actions in favor of inflammatory mechanisms and cell defense. But if those mechanisms started first, that caused local thyroid hormone deactivation, or what we call cellular hypothyroidism. Those mechanisms triggered autoimmunity, what we call Hashimoto's. The Hashimoto's destroys the thyroid gland, and now the person is diagnosed as primary hypothyroidism. And we give them thyroid hormone, and we upregulate the brain. That gets satisfied very quickly because the hypothalamus is 10 times more sensitive to thyroid hormone than the peripheral tissues, 10 times more sensitive. So a very small amount of thyroid hormone will normalize brain and TSH long before the peripheral tissues will be. But if we satisfy the brain, but the peripheral tissues are still in that thyroid hormone deactivation mode, then the person's brain is going to be normalized, the hypothalamus is going to be normalized, the peripheral tissues are still going to be struggling. And then sometimes what doctors do is say, well, I'll just give you even more and drive your TSH as low as possible. And what happens to those people many times is they now start to have hyperthyroid symptoms, edginess, anxiousness, they really sleep disruption, insomnia, they really start to have more neurologic symptoms, and yet they still have peripheral symptoms going on. And remember what I said before, as you drop TSH and TRH, it has a negative impact on the body's ability to convert T4 to T3, which really becomes problematic. So when the brain's getting a sense that it's flooded with thyroid hormone, then it's sending signals out to the peripheral tissues to say, hey, we're flooded. Do not convert more T4 to T3. You need to start deactivating this stuff. But because very few medical doctors are actually checking any more than TSH and T4 per the guidelines, they don't see that the person's T3 is low. Their free T3 is low. Their reverse T3 is elevated, so they don't know this mechanism is going on.
Yeah. So how do you help somebody who has cold intolerances? What would be the steps to help somebody?
So this doesn't change much from what we talk about all the time, right? At the end of the day, the way we're going to help somebody improve their thermogenesis, whether it's the obligatory or the adaptive or facultative thermogenesis, is we have to get more T4 and T3 into the peripheral cells to be able to support metabolism. And we have to help the cellular regulation of thyroid hormone favor the conversion of T4 to T3 versus the deactivation of T4 and T3. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that, with this, if you haven't had a complete thyroid panel, I think that that's probably step one, is to see, is the thyroid playing a role in your cold intolerances? Is there some underlying thyroid issues? Even if you've already had labs done, it may not be complete. That I think that that's going to be step one to determine, where are the issues lying? And just like we talk about all the time, then we have to go and ask the questions of, why is this happening? Figure out the underlying contributing factors that may be, leading to cellular resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to go back to the fact that, those lifestyle factors we talk about all the time. What's driving cellular stress? What's driving or triggering the autoimmune process? If we don't reduce or remove those, there isn't, we're going to run into problems with our patients, because they're going to continue to have hypothyroid symptoms. And even the best doctor who's trying to help them out by providing more thyroid hormone is going to do what we just talked about. They're going to they're going to essentially create a hyperthyroid state in the brain and a hypothyroid state in the peripheral tissues. And the person's going to be kind of stuck in that gray zone or that no man's land where their doctor says you're normal, but they don't feel normal at all.
Yeah. I have one last question I want to bring up. In the biohacking world and in, all the health and fitness, the biggest thing right now is, cold showers or cold thermogenesis or ice baths. What's your opinion on that and what it may do for somebody who already has maybe some cold intolerances? Do they just keep pushing through it, or is that something that can maybe lead to more issues?
So when we're talking about doing these kind of cold shock, just like heat, like sauna, those things are meant to stimulate adaptive changes, right? It's meant to kick into the immune system, and it's meant to kick in metabolism to do those things. The problem becomes if you already have a hypothyroid problem and you're putting greater cold exposure on the body, and you do not have the resources to bring up your thermogenic state, or that thermogenesis, whether it's obligatory or facultative, is not working well, you really may make yourself not feel so well. I'm a huge fan of the healthy person doing some type of cold therapy or hot therapy. I mean, if you're talking about, if you're trying to lose extra weight, just kind of burn off some of the extra fat, one of the best things you can do is go outside in the cold and exercise, because you need to increase your energy to do the actions you're doing. Plus, you need to increase energy to drive heat. So that's one of the reasons why swimming is such a great activity for excessive body fat, is because you're in cool water constantly. And so the body's got to generate heat to power the muscles, but the body also has to generate heat, has to generate energy to burn muscles, but it has to generate heat to keep the body warm. So it does essentially double duty. But I think you have to be very cautious if you are a person who's struggling with thyroid issues, that you don't really create greater harm. And I'll give you a great example of that, and that's me. when I was struggling with my Hashimoto's a number of years ago, and I was running, half marathons and doing adventure races, I'm pushing the limits at times. And, I had terrible Raynaud's in going on. And part of that was I was hypothyroid, got Hashimoto's. So I have the cellular hypothyroid state. I've got Hashimoto's going on. And so my circulation is not great. And now everybody knows, hey, when you have this cellular hypothyroid state, your cell metabolism is lower, you're not generating as much heat. And now I'm going outside in the cold to run, right? Which is causing more heat loss, which is causing more vasoconstriction, which is reducing the blood flow to my extremities and then allowing me to have this Raynaud effect as a result of that. Once I started getting myself healthier, getting that cellular thyroid physiology piece under control, I don't have Raynaud's anymore. I mean, I can go for runs, I can be out in the cold, I can be in the woods for 8-10 hours and no problems. And so it was the stress of training, it was the cold weather, it was the poor thyroid physiology at the cellular level. Because if we looked at my TSH was still within normal range, my antibody levels were elevated, I had higher reverse T3, my ratios were off, but I was still considered euthyroid if we look at the general guidelines, because we're only looking at TSH at that point in time. I mean, I was just barely over 3. So I wouldn't have been considered hypothyroid. So that's one of those reasons why I think you really need to understand your chemistry before you start trying to go shock the system. But I am a big fan of cold therapy and hot therapy and saunas. But I think it has to be for the right person at the right time.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of them too. But I think it comes down to that stress response that we always talk about. I think that there's, stress can be good to a certain degree, but when your body can't adapt to that stress and you're pushing those limits, I think then it can become, more negative than positive.
Yeah. So we talk about the teeter-totter effect quite a bit. And that is that we're always going to be bombarded by stress. But if all the stress is what we call distress or more negative stress, that can really weigh us down. And then there's eustress, which is actually good stressors, and that can kind of help balance the scale. But if you have a lot of negative stress going on and then you add more stress like excessive exercise or enjoying yourself too much, right? Those things are the things that can push the scale and really tip you into a more unhealthy state. I talked to somebody a couple of days ago as we were talking about the health in the new year, and there's one of their goals was they're going to eliminate all their stress. Well, that's never going to happen, right? There's never going to be a day when you don't have stress in your life. And I think one of the most important things that I see, and I'm sure you do, is we all have stress. Sometimes it can be really crazy amounts of stress, for everybody. I've had tons of stress, you've had tons of stress. And what being healthier does and what being fitter allows for you to do is be able to adapt to that stress better. Whereas you might see someone who's already in chronic health issues, has poor habits, poor lifestyle, and then you add more stress to their system, they just can't manage it as well. So you'll never get rid of all the stress, and that's not the goal. Stress can be good, but it can also be bad. And what you want to do is put yourself, your body in the best state it can be so that you can adapt to the stress, move on, and grow from that experience.
Absolutely. I agree with all of that.
So what would you suggest if we were going to give today's listeners a couple tips regarding being chronically cold all the time? What would you give as some recommendations that they could walk away with?
I would say the first thing is, if you're experiencing symptoms of, unresolved thyroid issues and you haven't been tested, I would say that that's going to be the first thing is you want to get tested. Either find a functional medicine doctor to run a full panel on you, or, start with your primary if you've never had that tested. And 2, realize that that's not a normal symptom, that there's definitely a reason why that's happening. It's not just, it doesn't run in your family. It's not just that's been you since you were a kid. You may have had underlying thyroid issues since you were a kid. And so I think that that's a really important thing to understand, is that recognize I think that's step one of any sort of change, is recognizing that there's something not right. And then 3, listen to the other podcasts that we have and start implementing some of the foundational things and see if you can get change. See if you can, increase your body temperature and, reduce that cold intolerances. Start with, diet and trying to reduce stress, not eliminate it, but obviously we want to reduce it and work on the things that you can manage. I think that those are going to be the top things that I would recommend to somebody.
Absolutely. I think those things make a ton of sense. Everybody worries about what they can't do or what's going to be. Just do what you can. And then if you start with doing the things that you can, that'll be huge. From a getting a tested perspective, I think that's great. If you have chronic hypothyroid symptoms, if you struggle with cold intolerance, we would definitely both recommend a comprehensive thyroid panel. Understand that when you go to see your primary care physician or your endocrinologist, they are going to run what they've been taught to do. They're not bad people. It's just what they've been taught to do. And that's what the guidelines say, is they're going to run what they call a TSH with reflex to T4 or free T4, which means that if they're going to run a TSH on the blood that's drawn. If the TSH is normal, no further testing is going to be done. If TSH is abnormal, too high, too low, then they will typically run the free T4 to see what that value is. If free T4 is within normal range, you're going to be diagnosed potentially as subclinical hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, and no treatment's going to be given. That's the best you're going to get. So if that's not what you're looking for, then you want to search out a functional medicine practitioner, and typically we're going to run a more comprehensive panel. TSH, T4, T3, free T4, free T3, T3 uptake, thyroid antibodies, reverse T3. We're going to look at the ratios of those values so we can make some understanding there. I think a really good functional medicine practitioner is also going to run a more comprehensive blood panel than your general practitioner is going to run. And why is that important? Because we want to be looking for other indications of hypothyroidism by looking at the labs, abnormal cholesterol levels as an example, and abnormal blood sugar levels, insulin resistance. But we also want to look for things like what might clues as to the fact that there's something driving cellular hypothyroidism or glandular hypothyroidism. Like we're going to look for markers of inflammation, elevated CRP, homocysteine, fibrinogen, uric acid, low bilirubin. So we'll look for those markers of inflammation or oxidative stress. And then the other thing we want to get out of blood work is to find out what tissue systems are already compromised and are probably going to need some support to recover and rebuild and regenerate. So we want to look for insulin resistance. We want to look for indicators of fatty liver, of lipid dysregulation, of compromised biliary function, of iron dysregulation, of chronic infection. And so we want to look for those indicators, because sometimes people come to you and I and say, hey, I want you to fix my thyroid physiology. Do I just take T3? Do I just take selenium? Do I take those things? I think we have to make sure, and we say this all the time, that in most cases, we believe that thyroid physiology problems aren't the mistake, but that's the body's regulatory system to say, hey, we've got a problem, slow down the metabolism, shift energy towards cell defense, and take it away from building new tissues and growth. And so we look at hypothyroidism, whether it's cellular, Hashimoto's, or glandular, as the body's regulatory system trying to slow down cell tissue cell growth and instead shift it toward defense. So we want to see what's that long-term impact been on your other cells and tissues. If you're already insulin resistant, just improving more thyroid hormone to the tissue is not going to necessarily fix your insulin resistance. We have to help you guide that. We have to help you support detoxification pathways that now, after 5, 10, 15 years of unknown or hidden hypothyroidism, just don't work the same way. We can look at how thyroid physiology, we can maybe get the thyroid physiology reset, but the systems may not come back online. It's like your car. If the front end goes out of alignment, we can realign the front end of the car. But if the tires have worn inappropriately during that year or so you've been driving that car when the front end's been out of line, it's going to go right back out of line and continue to create problems because the tires have now changed. So now we need to put new tires on, then realign it, and then the car will run fine. Sometimes in the body, the same thing is going on. The GI tract has been dysfunctional for such a long time. We have to support the rebuild, the regeneration. So for me, and I'm sure you'd say the same thing, a really good comprehensive blood panel looked at from optimal ranges, not lab ranges or disease ranges, and interpreted appropriately can give a doctor so much information that it is the foundational test that we, in a worst case scenario, if you only had a good comprehensive blood panel, you'd be fine because you would have so much data to get the person better. Yep, we like things like Dutch and GI map tests and organic acids. We love those tests. But when it comes down to it, I feel that a really good comprehensive metabolic panel with a comprehensive thyroid panel as part of it is like the foundational thing. And unfortunately, it's just not done anymore in the allopathic model because insurance companies continue to restrict the amount of tests that can be run.
Yeah, it's sad, but I mean, I definitely think that it's a big foundational thing that, you know, if you're struggling with unresolved symptoms, that's a great starting point to help, you know, gather that data so that you can start kind of funneling where do you got to go from there.
Right. So I think what we'll do is we'll wrap this podcast up. This was all about cold intolerance, understanding that yes, thyroid hormone does play a critical role in heat generation in the body. And if you struggle with heat generating problems, you struggle with cold intolerance, you're always cold when you're walking around your house, even in the middle of summer, you got to put sweaters on. When you go out in the wintertime, you need multiple layers and those little heat things that you put in your shoes and in your gloves. You very well may have a thyroid problem, and it could be glandular, which means you're in a kind of the end stage of thyroid disorder. You have primary hypothyroidism where the gland can't make enough thyroid hormone, or you may be at the state where you're still in cellular hypothyroidism, where it's just individual cells and tissues are really struggling to convert thyroid hormone that you are able to make. So if you're struggling with cold intolerance, reach out to definitely, if you've been to your primary care endocrinologist and they're not helping you, reach out to a functional medicine practitioner to evaluate your blood chemistry, to evaluate a more comprehensive thyroid panel, to look at your health history, your symptoms, help you identify that, yes, you have a cellular thyroid issue that's driving this cold intolerance. And then if you have a functional medicine practitioner, they should be guiding you in these steps to identify the root cause issues, reduce or remove those as much as possible, and then support the recovery and restoration of thyroid physiology and the compromised systems with diet, lifestyle, and nutritional protocols, supplemental protocols. All right?
All right.
All right, so we're going to wrap this one up. This is the first one of the new year. I wish you the best new year, and we wish all of our listeners the best year this year coming up that they've had so far. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please go to iTunes or wherever you watch or listen to your podcast and give us the highest star rating. Would be happy with us. And if you have questions, I know I've gotten some questions for people of topics that they'd like to hear more information about on future podcasts, and we'll be doing that. But yeah, give us a rating, share our podcast with your friends and family, and keep tuning in.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for listening.
You got it. Take care.
Bye.